So, Billy Yank, my very good friend, wasn't it kinda about states' rights?
Yeah, Johnny Reb. States' rights.
To own slaves! Whew.
There it is.
Checkmate, Lincolnites! Welcome back to the show. I missed you all so very much. Now, watch and be amazed, for tonight I will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the war between the states had nothing to do with slavery. It was about states' rights versus tyrannical overreach in federal government.
Not really, man.
Hold your horses now. John C. Calhoun himself said that if there be no protective power for the states, they must be forced to rebel. What about the Tariff of Abominations in 1828? States' rights was an issue way before slavery. What about the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion? And there were many other times when issue of states' rights or limitation on federal power in general popped up as stated. Also, I must ask, are you an anarcho-syndicalist?
I don't know what that is, so... No. But to your point, yeah, I mean, states' rights was a huge issue in the early national and antebellum periods and remains one to this day, as was slavery, right from the very beginning. The two issues intertwined in really interesting and complex ways before finally coming to a head in the secession winter of 1861. It's a big topic, so would you mind if we went about this chronologically?
Certainly. Where shall we begin?
7 years ago, baby.
Aha! The first war of American independence. A pity you Northerners grew to become the self-same yoke we once fought so hard to throw off. Forced into secession by your many aggressions and usurpations, we reluctantly took up the mantle of American freedom to found a truly more perfect union as the Founding Fathers had intended. A confederacy of autonomous republics vis-a-vis the states, bound together for mutual advantage, but free to pursue our own destinies and stuff.
Well, we tried that at first, with the Articles of Confederation, but that worked about as well as a screen door in a submarine.
Well, you would think that, wouldn't you? Because it was you government-worshipping Northerners who bamboozled us liberty-loving Southerners into ratifying the Constitution and accepting a much more powerful federal government than we had originally bargained for.
Actually, most educated people in the Deep South were all for the Constitution and eagerly sought the stability it provided. The Revolutionary War had been incredibly hard on the Carolinas and Georgia. The fighting there was highly unconventional and brutally partisan, and it absolutely devastated the entire region. And we got to remember, at the time, these were still sparsely populated backcountry colonies. The halcyon days of King Cotton were still far in the future. In 1788, the South Carolina House of Representatives met to consider ratification of the new Constitution. Arguing for the document's merits, Federalist delegate Charles Cotesworth Pinckney did not mince words.
The southern states are weak. We are so weak that by ourselves we could not form a union strong enough for the purpose of effectually protecting each other. Without union with the other states, South Carolina must soon fall. Is there anyone among us so much a Quixote as to suppose that this state could long maintain her independence if she stood alone, or was only connected with the southern states? I scarcely believe there is.
You mentioned Shays Rebellion, which is a perfect example of what Pinckney was talking about here. In 1786, a year before the Constitutional Convention, Massachusetts raised taxes to insanely high levels.
What a shocker.
Under the Articles of Confederation, the state government was basically unaccountable, and these taxes disproportionately affected the very poor. When they inevitably couldn't pay, the state seized their homes. So, led by a veteran named Daniel Shays, they picked up their guns and went down to their county seat to physically prevent the courts from issuing further foreclosure orders.
Sounds like a bunch of troublemaking freeloaders looking for a handout.
They were white.
Brave rebels. The tree of liberty must be watered by the blood of patriots.
Soon, protest erupted into open revolt. The Confederation government was basically toothless, so it was up to Massachusetts to put the rebellion down. It took the state months to organize a response, and there wasn't enough public money to raise a militia, so they had to rely on, get this, private donations from the wealthy, who certainly didn't want a bunch of poor people with guns running around. Once they did raise troops, the rebellion was quashed pretty quickly, but all things considered, the government's handling of the crisis had been an utter disaster. Again, Charles Pinckney put it well.
Ask the people of Massachusetts if the Confederation protected them during the insurrection of Shays.
His words take on a whole new meaning when you consider that South Carolina's greatest threat of rebellion came from within many South Carolinians' own homes. Their own oppressed underclass had a much longer and more turgid list of grievances than any Shays regulators could write. And if a relatively small rural rebellion could bring a prosperous and populous state like Massachusetts to its knees under this system, then what possible chance would the states of the Deep South have in the event of their worst nightmare? A full-scale slave revolt.
All right. So perhaps the Confederation government was to be improved upon. But you can't deny that we Southerners ratified the Constitution only warily. We embraced it out of necessity, but opposed it ideologically. I now quote Representative Rawlins Lowndes, a most honorable gentleman, responding to Charles Pinckney in that same debate.
The Treaty of Peace with Britain expressly agreed to acknowledge us as free, sovereign, and independent states, which privileges we lived at the present in exercise of. But this new Constitution at once swept those privileges away, being sovereign over all, so that this state will dwindle into a mere skeleton of what it was.
Well, you're not going to like this, but the reason that Lowndes was so concerned about South Carolina's waning self-sovereignty was because of that part in the Constitution that allowed Congress to ban the importation of slaves starting 20 years from then, in 1808. In his rebuttal to Lowndes, Pinckney explained that they had had to fight tooth and nail to keep the importation of slaves going at all, and urged slave owners to consider other important constitutional guarantees for slavery that they had been able to secure.
By this settlement we have secured an unlimited importation of Negroes for 20 years, nor is it declared that the importation shall be then stopped. It may be continued. We have a security that the general government can never emancipate them, for no such authority is granted. We have obtained a right to recover our slaves in whatever part of America they may take refuge, which is a right we had not before. In short, considering all circumstances, we have made the best terms for the security of this species of property it was in our power to make.
So this debate was two guys disagreeing about how best to support the plantation economy. Antebellum history would prove Pinckney right. Yes, Southerners had to make some concessions, but overall, the new federal compact proved to be an enormous boon for American slavery. The slave states gained much more than stability. They also negotiated some very favorable deals for themselves that greatly enlarged their political influence within the new Union, such as the 3/5 Compromise. Over the next 70 years, the Constitution would aid Southern interests much more than it would ever hinder them.
I don't know about that, but one of the deals made during the Constitutional Convention included a provision which allowed states to leave the Union if they were dissatisfied with statehood. The states that seceded in 1861 attempted to do this and were wrongly warred upon by Lincoln and the federal government.
Well, dude, this is a moot point anyway because of Texas v. White, but I'll indulge you. Where is that provision exactly?
The right to secede is in Article 10.
It's Amendment 10.
Amendment 10. Our great Constitution is built in a way of enumerated powers. That means the government can only do what is listed. All else is a right granted to the states, including secession.
Okay, so the 10th Amendment reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." That's certainly a very broad curtailing of federal power, but I don't see anything in there about state secession.
It's implied.
Okay, well, if we're just vague booking our way through constitutional law here, I could just as easily point to Article 6, Section 2, which states, "The authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." In a number of early decisions, the Supreme Court interpreted that clause to mean that when federal and state law clash, federal law is supreme. That would certainly imply that unilateral secession over something like, oh, I don't know, an election not going your way would be super illegal.
Nice myth, if you worship government. According to James Madison, the great architect of our Constitution, there is nothing ambiguous about the powers that are granted to the federal government, as he says in Federalist 45. And might I add that this James Madison fellow, he was a founding father.
The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects, as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will for the most part be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all of the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state.
True enough, but you forget that Madison also wrote, in plain English, that once admitted, states do not have the right to withdraw from the Union.
The Constitution requires an adoption in toto and forever. It has been so adopted by the other states. An adoption for a limited time would be as defective as an adoption of some of the articles only. This idea of states reserving the right to withdraw was started at Richmond, and considered as a conditional ratification, which was itself considered as worse than a rejection.
His whole theory of the compound republic proved to be pretty crucial to Southern political thought. Thanks in part to Eli Whitney, over the coming decades the cotton industry exploded, and the slave states of the Deep South multiplied and prospered. Plantation agriculture expanded to the Gulf Coast and beyond. Per Federalist 45, slave owners could wield the fearsome apparatus of central government in pursuing external objects, namely expanding the nation's southwestern borders and making those states and territories hospitable to slavery. Concerning internal objects, the sovereignty of the states was supreme. Within their little state fiefdoms, slaveholder elites could rule however they saw fit, which allowed them to unaccountably and brutally police their black underclass. The arrangement worked out very well for them. Their only fear was that one day, an anti-slavery federal government would try to meddle with the institution, and more broadly, the racial order that American slavery had established.
You forget there was also Southern opposition to an ever more authoritarian federal government that had nothing to do with slavery. When your unlamented progenitor, the fat, toothless, obnoxious, and disliked President John Adams, signed the Alien and Sedition Acts into law, it was the great southern states of Kentucky and Virginia who stood against this early form of Yankee tyranny.
That's right. Inspired primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Upper South had a states' rights doctrine that was initially much more libertarian, and was only incidentally concerned with the rights of slaveholders.
Exactly. And it was that spirit of 76 that swelled within us, swelling, until it erupted out of us into a pure white font of freedom, which gave rise to this, our second war of independence.
Not quite. In the years following the War of 1812, things changed. First came the controversy which led to the Missouri Compromise. In 1819, congressional disagreements about the expansion of slavery to the soon-to-be state of Missouri exploded into a full-blown sectional crisis as anti-slavery lawmakers launched their first major attack on the institution's thus far unmolested westward expansion.
Oh, well, that was just a cynical attempt by the North to keep the balance of power tipped in their favor. Missouri wanted to be admitted as a slave state. But you Northerners knew that would give the South more representation in Congress, and we can't have that now, can we?
Actually, there's every indication that James Talmadge, the congressman who initially proposed restricting slavery in Missouri, did so on moral grounds. And in any case, Northern public opinion was united on the issue. Slavery was an affront to nature, and allowing its unchecked expansion to the West would constitute a betrayal of the foundational American values of freedom and equality. Debating the issue on the floor of the House, Representative Arthur Livermore of New Hampshire argued that the very soul of America was at stake.
An opportunity is now presented, if not to diminish, at least to prevent, the growth of a sin which sits heavy on the souls of every one of us. By embracing this opportunity, we may retrieve the national character, and in some degree our own. But if we suffer it to pass unimproved, let us at least be consistent, and declare that our Constitution was made to impose slavery, not to establish liberty.
What's that I smell a wafting down from the north? Is that the odor of hypocrisy?
No, I just farted.
When was slavery abolished up there in the Yankee states? Remind me again.
Well, for the most part in the 1780s, when emancipation ceased to be the province of tree-hugging Quakers and entered the political mainstream.
You know as well as I that most northern states didn't abolish slavery right away. In fact, due to considerable backlash from their own slave owners, they began a process of gradual emancipation, some of which didn't take full effect for decades. Is this not so?
It is.
Furthermore, census data reveals that northern New England was the only region where these slaves were freed relatively quickly. In 1820, as the supposedly anti-slavery northerners were moralizing about this supposedly southern evil during the Missouri crisis, there were 48 slaves in Rhode Island, 97 slaves in Connecticut, 10,088 slaves in New York, 7,557 slaves in New Jersey, and 211 slaves in Pennsylvania. So much for your free states.
Yeah, I got nothing to say to that.
Might as well end the episode there.
Well, hang on just a goddamn minute. I haven't finished my larger point. Despite the hypocrisy of it, which I fully acknowledge, the North was united in opposing the expansion of slavery. So, faced with such strong opposition, Upper South Jeffersonian planters joined forces with Deep South pro-slavery planters to create a solid Southern political bloc to meet it. For the first time in American history, the country was divided, not just along political, but sectional lines, with slavery the cornerstone of conflict.
One must look at more than just the surface issue. What does slavery represent? I say it represents 1. Economic continuity, a refusal to upend and crash the Southern economy. 2. Social continuity, a desire to preserve the social status quo and avoid social upheaval. And 3. Political continuity, clinging to the existing political order of individual and states' rights.
That economic continuity could be better described as naked self-interest, because again, by this time, plantation agriculture had become extremely profitable and made the white upper class of the South insanely rich. That social continuity was a draconian racial hierarchy that was predicated on the violent subjugation and enslavement of millions of people for the sole purpose of raking in those insane profits. And that political continuity of states' rights was becoming ever more intertwined with slavery and the defense of slavery.
Jesus.
For example, in 1822, South Carolina passed the Negro Seamen's Act, which declared that all foreign free black sailors visiting the port of Charleston would have to be detained in the local jail for the duration of their visit. One Jamaican sailor took South Carolina to federal court over this, claiming that the statute violated the 1815 Commercial Convention between the United States and Great Britain. The court ruled in his favor and declared the Seamen's Act unconstitutional. Slave owners were furious. They believed the ruling flew in the face of Madison's concept of external and internal jurisdiction and represented a dangerous and destabilizing attack on the racial hierarchy of the South. Writing in the aftermath of the decision, the governor of Georgia predicted that
soon, very soon, the federal government, discarding the mask, will openly lend itself to a combination of fanatics for the destruction of everything valuable in the southern country. The moment we cease to be masters, we shall be slaves.
And then, during the fallout of the Tariff of 1828, the flirtation of states' rights politics and pro-slavery power became an out-and-out marriage. No one was more instrumental in this than John C. Calhoun. He fiercely opposed the tariff.
The Tariff of Abominations.
The Tariff of Abominations, which had a number of deleterious effects on the Southern economy. It was a sectional dispute, at the end of a long decade of sectional disputes. Calhoun's constitutional theories, which he was developing during this period, thus took on a distinctly sectional flavor. Rabidly pro-slavery, Calhoun harmonized the Upper South's distrust of centralized power with the Deep South's terror of emancipation into a radical reimagining of Madison's compound republic. In his mind, the idea that the United States was a cohesive national polity was constitutional heresy, and he believed that states basically had unlimited powers to protect themselves from federal interference and the tyranny of the majority.
Well, that sounds nice.
The devil comes in a pleasing shape. Calhoun's theory of government came to be almost exclusively concerned with furthering Southern slaveholder interests. And as these ideas gained traction, Virginian lawyers Abel Upshur and Beverly Tucker wrote influential polemics, bringing rights of property and slaves to the very center of Jeffersonian constitutional thought. What emerged from this ideological confluence of the 1820s South was a political platform that came to be broadly known as Southern rights. Many of its principles would go on to be foundational tenets of the Confederate worldview.
Here's my holdup with this narrative of yours, and I mean this sincerely. The Declaration of Independence gives us the right to pursue our own happiness, free from government interference. Yes, slavery was evil, but there's another principle involved here, is there not? Give the government an inch on one issue and they'll take a mile on another one. Next thing you know, you're getting groped by rent-a-cops at the airport. Therefore, I would argue that states' rights were a crucial component of the checks and balances of power. Rights stamped out under the boot heels of 1 million Yankee soldiers. And our country is lesser for it.
Well, I would argue that within the philosophy of Southern rights, individual and state rights always took a back seat to economic advantage and political power. What you would describe as a conflict between Northern authoritarianism and Southern libertarianism, I would describe as a struggle between two competing concepts of American nationhood. Slave owners became convinced that the best security for their fortunes and property was to enshrine manifestly pro-slavery legislation into national law. The Constitution had become extremely accommodating of the slave system, but maddeningly, it lacked an explicit and concrete endorsement of human bondage. Southern rights advocates spent much of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s attempting to correct that mistake.
Aha! But what about the proposed Corwin Amendment in the winter of '61, just before the war? Lincoln offered the South the explicit constitutional protection for slavery that you say they were looking for, and yet we still seceded, proving it was about states' rights after all.
We already talked about the Corwin Amendment.
We did?
Yeah, way back in episode 1. So you mentioned the Corwin Amendment. I'm glad you did. That was basically the federal government's last-ditch attempt to avoid the Civil War. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Corwin Amendment was this proposed amendment to the Constitution that basically would have guaranteed the southern states' right to own slaves. I mean, potentially forever. So your implication would be that if the war was really about slavery, then why didn't the southern states just immediately go along with and ratify the Corwin Amendment? But you're forgetting that a big cause of the Civil War, and certainly the events leading up to the Civil War, were not about preserving slavery, but expanding it. I mean, you take the Missouri Compromise, for instance.
Wow. So young. So full of hope.
Long time ago.
Yeah.
More than 3 years now.
Yeah, wow.
So adding to the point made in the clip, the Corwin Amendment would have prohibited the federal government from interfering in the, quote, domestic institutions of the states. Specifically, and here it parrots the vague language that the framers used back in 1787, persons held to service. Confederates rejected the Corwin Amendment outright. To them, it was completely inadequate. As you said, it only protected slavery in the states where it existed in 1861. Confederates would settle for nothing less than the proposed Crittenden Compromise of 1860, which would have explicitly recognized African slavery, and it uses those exact words, as legitimate and constitutional, and completely immune from federal interference below the 3630 parallel established in the Missouri Compromise. And that would have included territorial gains made in Central and South America, something the planter class salivated over often enough. It's a big reason most of them supported the Mexican War. But there was no way that Lincoln and the Republicans could accept that. I mean, that would have been giving the South the exact same thing that they wanted from the very beginning, which was a legally binding admission that America was fundamentally a pro-slavery nation.
Back up now. You still haven't given me any proof that Southerners abused federal power for their own purposes.
Holy fucking shit, dude! Why don't we start with the Indian Removal Act? In the 1820s, forcible displacement of Native Americans from the southeastern U.S. was broadly popular among white Southerners, especially in Georgia, which had passed legislation outlawing the Cherokee tribal government and declaring its dominion over Cherokee land. Complementing this state resolution with federal action, Georgia Congressman Wilson Lumpkin introduced a proposal for Indian removal to the House of Representatives. Later in life, Lumpkin recalled how he was stymied at first by Northern humanitarian efforts.
I had in view relieving my own state from the encumbrance of our Indian population, but we still found many serious obstacles rose in the way over and above the zealous opposition of our open and determined opponents in both House and Congress. Moreover, during the recess of Congress, the northern fanatics, male and female, had gone to work and gotten up thousands of petitions, signed by more than 1 million of men, women, and children, protecting against the removal of the poor, dear Indians. And to finish the picture, in these petitions we were denounced as slaveholders.
Oh, that's right. The saintly North and the horrible, evil South. Tell me, who are these Yankees taking such a strong, principled stance against Indian removal?
Well, there was President John Quincy Adams, for one.
Oh, from Massachusetts, is that right?
From Braintree, yeah.
Massachusetts, interesting name for a state. Is that named after some place in England? Is there a quaint little village in Suffolk named Massachusetts?
No.
Really? Well, that is interesting. And where, pray tell, does the name originate?
The Massachusetts people, who lived there for thousands of years before we did.
Oh, and what happened to them?
Well, we took over all their good farmland, and that kind of forced them to convert to Christianity and assimilate with us. And then we got really paranoid that they were going to turn on us, so we,
Yes?
So we rounded them all up and put them in this internment camp on this crappy little island in Boston Harbor in the middle of winter. Okay, yeah. Northern opposition to Indian removal was incredibly hypocritical, but sincerely felt.
Oh, I'm sure they offered up many thoughts and prayers.
The Cherokee were able to keep Georgia legally at bay with the help of some, yes, admittedly fairly flaccid support from the Adams administration. But then two things happened. First, gold was discovered in the mountains of North Georgia, making white settlement efforts much more urgent. And second, Adams was defeated and succeeded as president by Southerner Andrew Jackson, who staunchly supported removal and thought that Cherokee claims of self-sovereignty were inherently illegitimate.
I have long viewed treaties with the Indians an absurdity, not to be reconciled to the principles of our government. The Indians are the subjects of the United States, inhabiting its territory. Is it not absurd for the sovereign to negotiate by treaty with the subject?
When Jacksonians spoke of rights for citizens, they had a very specific idea of what kind of person that citizen was: a white man. Jackson's populism replaced class lines with racial and gendered ones. Jackson, and the white South more broadly, saw no place for Native Americans in the white man's republic. Natives living east of the Mississippi were an obstacle to white civilizational progress. The liberty and prosperity of the one necessitated the expulsion of the other. In an 1830 address to Congress, 6 months after signing the Indian Removal Act into law, President Jackson boasted that,
"It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of our government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion."
Jackson's presidency was in many ways a realization of Southern rights nationhood. A powerful, decisive executive in external affairs, but highly deferential to slaveholder interests in internal ones. And most importantly, a staunch defender of the white supremacist social order.
In your eagerness to blame white people in every video you make, you're forgetting about the nullification crisis. Wait. I just had the most profound sense of deja vu. In your eagerness to blame white people in every video you make, you've forgotten about the nullification crisis.
Man, we must really be running low on comments if we're recycling shit from episode 3.
Well, these are complex, nuanced topics, and they're not gonna...
Oh, I know.
They just don't have the,
Yeah. Anyway, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, John C. Calhoun nearly led South Carolina to secession over a states' rights issue during Jackson's presidency. The rights of South Carolina to nullify the tariff we previously discussed. Jackson wasn't obsequious to planter class interests then. In fact, he was maneuvering troops for a potential invasion. Sounds positively Lincolnian, sir.
If Louisiana had tried to secede from the Confederate states during the Civil War, do you think Jefferson Davis would have let that happen?
No, not if he was in any position to stop it, but that was wartime. The circumstances would have been different. What's your point?
My point is that there's more than one kind of union, and all sorts of different kinds of flavor of unionist. Jackson's joust with Calhoun was a squabble between two different strains of Southern rights nationalism. Similarly, Confederates would disagree about how far the states' rights principle went. And we'll get more into this later, but even most of them would agree that you can't just let the states do whatever, right? At a certain point, the central government has to put its foot down. South Carolina's secession would have jeopardized the security of the nation. So yeah, Jackson fiercely opposed it. In fact, you could argue that in threatening to secede, South Carolina became just the sort of external threat to white nationhood that Jackson habitually crushed. Why should the tranquility of white men in North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, or anywhere else be disturbed just because of the caprice of South Carolina? And in any event, in all other aspects of his presidency, Jackson sanctified the rights of slave states and slaveholders. The truly grave threats to the Union, he believed, were up north. He placed the blame for sectional politics squarely on the shoulders of abolitionists.
Wait, really?
The abolitionist movement really started to gain traction in the 1830s, and what's more, they began to organize, to form community networks and publish mass media. These guys were the most radical of the radical, and a very motley crew. Whites, blacks, men, women, some women in positions of leadership.
I definitely would have been an abolitionist if I was alive back then.
Shut up. The mere existence of these organizations challenged the legitimacy of the white man's republic, and they could be very disruptive. In the summer of 1835, abolitionists flooded the Southern mails with radical literature, causing a huge uproar and widespread panic of black rebellion. Slave states quickly passed laws ordering local postal workers to take the incendiary mail out of circulation, and thousands of pamphlets were confiscated and burned.
Well, that doesn't seem great, free speech-wise. Burning books and such.
True to form, Jacksonian central government came swiftly to the defense of the slave system against this external threat from women, blacks, and race traders. The president threw full federal support behind the local ordinances, arguing that the states had every right to preserve order however they saw fit. He praised Northern Democrats for speaking out against the radicals, telling Congress that
it is fortunate for the country that the good sense and the deep-rooted attachment of the people of the non-slaveholding states to the Union and to their fellow citizens of the same blood in the South have given so strong and impressive a tone to the sentiments entertained against the proceedings of the misguided persons who have engaged in these unconstitutional and wicked attempts.
Did you catch that? Fellow citizens of the same blood?
Oh, dang.
All this to say that this was Jackson's greatest contribution to the Confederate worldview. Within the in-group, people with penises and without melanin, individual liberty was absolute and irrevocable. But those liberties did not, under any circumstances, extend to the out-group. Against blacks, natives, and politically active women, central government was free to deploy a terrifying range of authoritarian powers with total impunity.
Well, that settles it. This episode is officially bumming me out.
Which brings us to the high watermark of pro-slavery ideology, the Fugitive Slave Law.
Wasn't there already a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution?
There was, but this was the other one.
Ah, yes, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793.
No. The other one. The South's key provision in the Compromise of 1850, which broadened the scope of previous fugitive slave laws. First, by denying suspected runaways the right to a fair trial, so in practice, the government could just black bag and enslave any black person and get away with it. And second, by stipulating that if white citizens failed to adequately assist slave catchers in their inquiries, or aid runaways in any way, they would be slapped with a ruinous fine and face imprisonment.
Tough break.
Abolitionists were outraged and promised slave catchers that any attempt they made to enforce the law in their communities would be met with powder and shot. Free blacks began to plan a mass emigration to West Africa or Central America, citing the Mayflower Pilgrims as their precedent. The Dred Scott decision in 1857, which enshrined into law the idea that black people are ineligible for American citizenship by virtue of their race, simply confirmed what most blacks already knew. Not citizens, but subjects. Like what Andrew Jackson said about the Indians. Pre-frickin-cisely. Northern whites, for their part, looked on in mounting horror as a reactionary political bloc of slave masters dragged the country back into the 17th century, in sharp contrast to the hemispheric trend of modernization and emancipation. So, they made their voices heard at the polls. They flocked to the nascent Republican Party and elected Abraham Lincoln President of the United States. And that, as they say, was that. Not quite. There's still one more piece of this puzzle left. Remember back in episode 5 when I went on that whole tangent about industrial slavery? In their public discourse, speeches, editorials, and pamphlets, the planter class placed much less importance on their Jeffersonian agrarian ideals and much more on them gaining economic independence from the North through internal industrialization. And they believed the best way to do this was through the directive of the state, not private interests. As we've talked about before, the Confederacy was way more centralized than most people give it credit for, and there's ample evidence to suggest that in the event of a Southern victory, the central Confederate government would have become even stronger, as it directed private interests to create economic and industrial power that would effectively compete with that of the North. Yes. When the South seceded in the winter of '61, the planter class marveled at all the opportunities that lay before them. For the first time since 1787, they had no compromises to make, no bleeding heart Northerners holding them back, so they looked to the future and their imaginations ran wild with possibilities. A minority faction, led by former Governor of Virginia Henry Wise, briefly flirted with the idea of an armed coup d'etat in Washington, preventing Lincoln from taking power, but most Confederates envisioned a process of separation and expansion, first winning independence from the United States by force, and then eclipsing it as a continent-spanning world power. Their first order of business was to organize a reconfederation of the states, to weld them together while they are hot, in the words of politician William Henry Trescott. This was accomplished quickly ahead of the Confederate Constitutional Convention in Montgomery in February of 1861. The new Constitution saw a retreat from states' rights doctrine and a noticeable shift toward the centralization of power, specifically in regard to things like taxation, territorial policy, and of course, the rights of slaveholders. The most vocal of the centralizers advocated for the nationalization of slavery. States' rights doctrine, they believed, had served its purpose in achieving separation from the anti-slavery North. Now, to ensure their security and continuing stability, the Southern Republic should be reorganized into the first American slave empire.
Who knows but that in the new order of things, which is to be inaugurated after the declaration of peace, which will assuredly come, we may find it to our advantage to lay this venerable doctrine of states' rights on the shelf. Let us adopt a stable and centralized system, adjusted to preserve the personal respect of every citizen and free from the fluctuations of popular caprice.
Oh, please. That was an outline opinion, not representative of the South as a whole.
It was at first, but for the rest of the Confederacy's short life, the clamor for centralization would only increase. What's more, its leading proponents were explicitly anti-democratic. During the war, the exigencies of United States Army invasion caused many to warm to the authoritarian ideas of Virginian George Fitzhugh, who had long maintained that
it would have been well for us if the seemingly pompous inanities of the Declaration of Independence, of the Virginia Bill of Rights, and the Act of Religious Toleration had remained dead letters. Their charlatanic, half-learned, pedantic authors believed that all men are created equal. This is an infidel doctrine.
hot damn. He continues.
We come now to the Southern Revolution of 1861, which we maintain was reactionary and conservative, a rolling back of the excesses of the Reformation, of Reformation run mad, a solemn protest against the doctrines of natural liberty, human equality, and the social contract as taught by Locke and the American sages of 1776, and an equally solemn protest against the doctrines of Adam Smith, Benjamin Franklin, Tom Paine, and the rest of the infidel political economists who maintained that the world is too much governed.
Holy
shit.
Yeah, it's sinister as fuck, dude. And by late 1863, when Fitzhugh wrote those words, there were more than enough white Southerners advocating for authoritarianism, or even monarchy, to constitute a serious threat to the Republic's long-term stability. And this horrified more moderate Confederates, as Augusta Jane Evans explained.
My countrymen have lost their former firm faith in democratic republicanism. I am pained and astonished to consider how many are now willing to glide unhesitatingly into a dictatorship, a military despotism.
But even the most pro-democracy Confederates were stuck in the mire of their own racism. The Confederate intelligentsia proffered bizarre and feverish theories of a patrician republic where planters of royal Norman stock dominated inferior Scotch, Irish, and Anglo-Saxon whites to nearly the same extent they dominated black slaves.
This is a lot to process.
When Jefferson Davis presented his pleas for official state recognition to the governments of France and Britain, he portrayed the Confederacy as a state which simply wanted to be left alone. He was lying through his teeth. The vision of Confederate nationalism, championed by Vice President Alexander Stephens and parroted by many others, imagined a future of global influence in which the Confederacy exported God-ordained ideas of racial apartheid to the rest of the civilized world. And speaking of God, after secession, Southern Protestant clergy jumped at the chance to add theocracy to the clean slate of their new government. South Carolina's leading minister, James Henry Thornwell, spent much of the war trying to batter down the wall between church and state.
This new confederacy has already, to some extent, rectified the error of the old Constitution, but not so distinctly and clearly as the Christian people of these states desire to see done. We venture respectfully to suggest that it is not enough for a state which enjoys the light of divine revelation to acknowledge in general terms the supremacy of God. It must also acknowledge the supremacy of his Son, whom he hath appointed heir to all things, by whom also he made the worlds. To Jesus Christ all power in heaven and earth is committed. To him every knee shall bow.
There's overwhelming evidence to suggest that the Confederacy was well on its way to becoming an autocracy. By the end of the Civil War, the Confederate worldview had drifted so far from the original intent of states' rights doctrine that it's hard to believe the two ideologies were ever once interrelated at all. And the idea that the Confederate States of America had, in any sense, a libertarian form of government is, frankly, laughable.
What the hell was that? According to the news, there was just an earthquake in Virginia.
Good evening. This is Matt Beat reporting live near Monticello in Virginia. We can now confirm that the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, has rolled over in his grave with enough force to trigger an enormous earthquake.
Oh, Jesus.
As you can see, Northern Virginia is completely destroyed. The death toll is catastrophic. Those who do remain have reverted to a primal state of nature. We have learned that what precipitated this massive earthquake was a reading of a historical quote in a production of a wildly unpopular web series known as Checkmate Lincolnites.
Oh, someone's calling. Ew, 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 ew. It's a 202 number. Why don't you take it? Hello?
Hey, is this, Jerry? Not Jerry, Johnny Reb and Billy Yank?
Yes?
Hey, man, it's Joe. President Joey Biden.
Oh my God. Hello, Mr. President. What an honor. Kiss ass.
Oh, thanks, man. Likewise. Listen, I'm calling to ask that maybe you don't quote any more of those shockingly authoritarian Confederate guys. Monticello was bad enough. We don't want Mount Vernon to blow too.
Yes, of course, Mr. President. I'm so sorry. It won't happen again.
All right, man. That's awesome, pal. That's good to hear, dude. Because, it's kind of a big deal. Well, with millions of people dying and everything, so I appreciate it, man.
Okay, great. Well, listen, Mr. President, while I have you, we've been sitting here for, I don't even know how long, talking about how the U.S. government was deeply complicit with the antebellum plantation class in the practice of slavery. And, while you were campaigning, you mentioned that you might try to get the ball rolling on federal reparations for slavery. So I was just wondering what the progress was on that so far. Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hast du es geschafft?
Ich habe mich etwas mehr als menschlich gemacht.
Ja, ist das klar. Das schöne Tage.
Sie werden noch mal kommen.
Nicht für mich. Warum bist du her?
We have lived many lives, mein Freund. Quadrillions, as far as I can tell. Many, many lives. But all lived for the same purpose.
Some have more purpose than others, it would seem. My research led nowhere. After years of investigations, digs and experiments, the Reichstag lost faith in the project. I fell out of favor with the Führer. In the end, even Heinrich renounced me. Clearly, you have succeeded where I failed.
Your weakness disgusts me.
I know.
But you have not yet outlived your usefulness. In 1967, your travels took you to Brazil, where you advised on a dig just outside Campinas. Is this correct?
Yes. At the Cementerio dos Americanos, a 19th century burial ground. After the American Civil War, a number of Confederates fled to Sao Paulo. That is where the most illustrious of them are buried. But we found nothing.
Do not lie to me.
Please, I'll talk. Just please. We found a sword. A sword that is said to have belonged to the Southern General Pete Beauregard.
Was there anything unusual about this sword?
You know very well that there was. This was no ordinary army sword. Its blade was made by night, deep in the Louisiana swamp, in a hidden forge encircled by a nameless bayou. This blade is said to have the power to bridge the gap between the worlds of the living and the world of the dead.
Where is it?
Just a little more time.
It would not have worked. Only the blood of a true American patriot can unleash its powers. But know this, you have served your purpose. Und der Süden wird auferstehen wieder.
Warte ab! Ich muss bin einen Gefallen bitten. Begrab mich darin. Heil Hitler!
Heil Hitler!